Did not. Good evening, I'm Karen Viskin from the Jewish Public Library. I'm so happy to be here tonight for our 4th live author reading on Facebook. The stories that we've heard so far have been heartfelt. They've taken us out of ourselves at this moment and brought us together. Tonight's stories will bring to mind our fathers, the men who shaped the world as we see it, and also our sons. Mine might still be young enough to ask me to marry him, but Joel's is a little bit older. I was lucky enough to know our author, first as a wonderful professor. Joel Yanofsky is also a 2-time winner of the Mavis Gallant Nonfiction Prize for his books Mordecai and Me, An Appreciation of a Kind, and Bad Animals, A Father's Accidental Education in Autism. He's written for numerous publications, won 2 national magazine awards. He lives in Montreal with his wife and son and 2 dogs. Joel?
Hi, Karen.
Over to you.
Hi. Okay. Thanks, first of all, to Karen and JPL for doing this. I'm going to warn you, I have a little bit of a cough, but it's nothing serious. So yes, as Karen was saying, father and sons is the theme of these short readings, and it's about what fathers teach their sons and what fathers learn from their sons. The first story is a piece I did in the Gazette about 10 years ago, maybe a little more, for Father's Day, and it's called The Guy in the Basement. My father liked practical jokes. One of his favorite running gags was to telephone his brother-in-law, my Uncle Solly, and pretend to be a woman. His falsetto was outlandish. His face turning an unhealthy shade of red, he could keep up the flirtation for a surprisingly long time. Bernie, my uncle would finally ask. Bernie, is that you? Who's Bernie? My father would squeak, laughing so hard by this point he was crying. My father died more than 30 years ago, which means I've had a lot of time to think about the kind of man he was and how he became that man. I've even wondered about his fondness for practical jokes. In retrospect, I can't help feeling it was related to the cosmic joke played on him when he was a boy. At 13, he'd begun to dream big the way teenagers do. He could draw anything, people, animals, landscapes, and do it all with ease. His plan was to go to art school in New York and study to be a cartoonist. Then he contracted polio and everything changed, including, I'm guessing, his sense of humor. That's my theory anyway, though I'm prepared to admit that if my father were around today, he'd say it was a cockamamie one. That's the word he'd use, cockamamie. He was just kidding around, he'd say. Maybe so, though the truth is fathers, alive or dead, have little influence on the theories their sons will inevitably devise about them. I have a teenage son myself, and I can already see the quizzical look on his face, the question forming, who is this guy really? Who was my father really? Bernard Yanofsky, known to his family and friends as Bernie, his customers as Barney, was a handsome man. You can see the movie star looks in his wedding photo. You can also see how he cultivated them. Not a single hair out of place. His mustache trimmed till his pencil thin, even his eyebrows looked combed. What you can't see in the photo is that the debonair image my father had of himself was often at odds with the image others had of him. He was considered, in the parlance of the day, a cripple. When he was first diagnosed with polio, he was not expected to live. When he survived, he wasn't expected to ever walk again. No one thought he'd be able to make a living or support himself, let alone a family. His in-laws privately worried that he wouldn't even be able to have a family. Still, he accomplished all these things. His life was proof that calling him a cripple was worse than cruel. It was inaccurate. But did the label stick? Did it affect how he felt about himself? How could it not? My father wore a brace on his right leg and an unforgiving contraption which caused him to fall often. He would go down with a thud so distinctive, I knew immediately what the sound signaled. And while my father could take a fall, he'd learned to over the years, he couldn't get up by himself. By the time I was a teenager, I was strong enough to lift him. It was always an awkward embrace, a mix of gratitude and impatience for both of us. What I should have understood at the time and didn't was how keenly he must have felt the reversal of roles, of his dependence on me, his son. But if my father considered himself unlucky in some things, he knew he was lucky in others, like letting my mother convince him he could make a living from his childhood talent for drawing. He became a sign painter and started his own business, Barney's Signs. In an era when most fathers left for the office early in the morning and returned late in the evening, my father was always home. He was the guy in the basement. There is, it occurs to me now, something disrespectful about that label, too, though not inaccurate. In any case, I think he learned to take it as a compliment, a testament to his constancy. He was always around, and because he was, I naturally took him for granted. When I was young, I remember my friends coming over and being amazed, first that he was there, and second that he was right downstairs, cutting paper and playing with paint, spattering it all over himself. They would have spent hours watching him too if I would have let them. Instead, I made up some excuse about him not wanting to be bothered while he worked. Still, he liked the company. He also liked to regale my friends who asked about his pronounced limp with the story of how he'd been a fighter pilot in the Second World War and had been shot down over Berlin or sometimes Tokyo. He lied and then winked in my direction. So while I knew the truth, I discovered it a few years earlier, like finding out there was no Santa Claus, I was expected to back my father up. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, as Sigmund Freud liked to say, but a joke is never just a joke. My father had dreamed up his cockamamie story for me and then later for my friends because he liked to kibitz, but also because he wanted what fathers want, to remain a hero in his son's eyes for as long as he could. I didn't understand the impulse at the time, but I do now. When my son was born, he had jaundice. It's not an uncommon condition in newborns, but in this case, the doctor wanted to be on the safe side and told my wife and me that our baby would have to spend the night under an ultraviolet lamp. I stayed up with him all that night. My job was to prevent him from displacing the mask protecting his eyes. It could damage his vision down the road, the doctor had explained matter-of-factly. So while my infant son squirmed and scratched at his face, I soothed him as best I could. When I couldn't, I focused on those frightening words, damage and down the road, and I held the mask securely in place while he cried. It was the toughest thing I'd ever done, the scariest too, and at the same time, the most important. I felt like, I don't know, a fighter pilot. The feeling didn't last. The next morning, I put my son's first diaper on backwards. Whoops, the nurse said, like she'd expected nothing less. There's neurological evidence that women get smarter after they give birth. I doubt the same is true of men. I heard an anthropologist once succinctly sum up a father's crucial but abbreviated role in the continuation of the species this way, from stud to dud to thud. Mark Twain famously said that when he was a boy of 14, he couldn't believe how ignorant his father was, but that when he got to be 21, he was astonished at how wise the old man had become in 7 years. I'm likewise astonished at how wise my father has become in the last 30 years. There's nothing surprising, of course, about sons realizing they have turned out more like their fathers than they ever imagined, that they have the same smile or hairline or temper. The real surprise is that this always comes as a surprise. Maybe that's because we absorb our father's lives and lessons gradually, the way the skin absorbs ultraviolet rays, the damage done and the benefits garnered down the road. And yes, it has occurred to me how closely I followed in my father's footsteps. And while I can't draw a straight line to save my life, I became a freelancer like him. I also learned from him by watching, by a kind of osmosis, how important it is to love what you do. Like my father, I work at home in my office downstairs. My son hasn't referred to me as the guy in the basement yet, but I'm guessing that one day he will. I plan to take it as a compliment. The next piece is an excerpt from the memoir I wrote called Bad Animals, A Father's Accidental Education in Autism. And as the subtitle suggests, this is about what fathers can learn from their sons. During the week-long March break, one of Jonah's therapists comes for a couple of hours each day, but that still leaves a lot of free time. So Cynthia has been taking Jonah to the park regularly. It has been unreasonably cold, but the two of them dressed in layers, take snacks and blankets, and are gone for hours. Things are easier for all of us when Jonah has some physical exercise, and Cynthia says they just need to get out of the house for a while, by which she means away from me. This is hard to argue with. I'm not good company these days. Even when I'm holed up in the basement, my general gloom somehow seeps upward. My so-called memoir is now the unofficial title of the book I'm writing, and it's not going well. I've sent proposal letters to a few literary agents in Toronto, and so far only one has gotten back to me requesting an outline. Outline? If I could come up with an outline, I wouldn't need a book. I'd have a life. So I find myself giving up on the manuscript daily. There's too much to say. I try to break the process down. I know what I have to do. Just write a sample chapter, one lousy sample chapter I'm happy with, and that will be enough. But so far, no luck. So what are you two doing in the park? I asked Cynthia when she returns late one afternoon. I'm desperate for company, desperate to stop writing. I can't tell you, it's a surprise. Come on, I whine, tell me, please. All right, she says, I wanted you to see it in person. I was going to drag you to the park tomorrow, but here. She sits me down on the couch and hands me her phone. Then she calls Jonah. He comes running in and slides to a kind of abrupt, tilting Charlie Chaplin style stop. He gives us each a look, somewhere between desperation and frustration. Now what? I imagine him whining. He just wants to get back to the Katy Perry video he was watching and is angry because we're bothering him. I realize now why I didn't recognize that look. It's his pre-teenage scowl. He hasn't perfected it yet, but it's reassuring to know he's working on it. If there was a book called What to Expect from Your 11-Year-Old, I'm sure this look, what it means, what it portends, how to deal with it, would be covered thoroughly in an early chapter. We're going to show Daddy what you've been doing in the park, my wife Cynthia says, and then you can go back to Katy Perry. We all huddle close so we can watch the small screen on our phone together. Look, Jonah, tell Daddy who that is and where. That's Jonah in the park, he says, still distracted. I hear him on the video singing, You Could Be Swinging on a Star, before I can make out what he's doing. Then I see him on the move, suspended from one bar, then the next. There must be a dozen on this particular jungle gym. He's not smooth, but he keeps going slowly, deliberately. He's wearing winter clothes and gloves, which are probably making the task harder. Still, if he feels the strain, he's not showing it. He's certainly not hurrying. Cynthia zooms in for a close-up, and that's when I see another unfamiliar expression on my son's face, absolute determination. I also watch his two boys, a little bigger than Jonah, come up behind him on the monkey bars. Even after the fact, I can feel a knot of worry settle in my chest as if I'm there with him right now. He's not going fast enough, I think. I almost shouted at him to hurry. The other boys are watching him closely. When Jonah finally makes it to the last bar and drops to the ground, the other two boys follow along with him and pat him on the back. This is the first time he made it. He made it all the way around, right, Jonah? Cynthia says. It's a task we've been on with him. It's a task we've been trying on with him for months, unsuccessfully until now. Right. And who are those guys? I ask. Tell Daddy who they are. Cynthia smiles at me and gives me a nudge with her shoulder. They're my friends from the park. Making friends is a task we've been working on for years with Jonah too, which is why I want their names, telephone numbers, landline and cell, their email addresses, Twitter accounts, all their particulars. Cynthia takes my hand and squeezes. But before I can ask Jonah anything else, he's gone back to his room like none of this is a big deal. And one more, which is called Whatever Will Be. This appeared in the New York Times online parenting column, parenting website, Motherload. And it was shortly after the book came out in the United States, but it's not from the book. It's a couple of years later. Whatever will be, it should be interesting. At least that's what I've been telling guests in advance of my son Jonah's bar mitzvah next week. Sometimes I wish we'd add this phrase, part disclaimer, part promo, to the invitations that went out a couple of months ago. Anyone who's organized a bar or bat mitzvah, communion, a sweet 16, even a big birthday party knows how much there is to prepare. But when your child has autism, as Jonah does, the preparations never seem to end, nor does the worrying about everything that might go wrong. So yes, it's even money that on the day of his bar mitzvah, Jonah will do something interesting. I'm betting that just as the rabbi is briefing him on the significance of this time-honored ritual, Jonah will give a big shout out to his favorite animal, the zebra. That is Jonah's move. He's a sweet, lovable kid who quite regularly says or does things we can't explain to other people, things that will invariably seem kind of weird. But then everyone around here is acting a little weird lately. Jonah's Hebrew tutor, for instance, is concerned about him dropping the Torah, thus dooming us all to an Indiana Jones-style curse. My wife, Cynthia, has concluded that there are too many guests and too few tables. Someone's sitting on the floor, she keeps muttering to herself. As for me, I fall asleep humming the tune to Que Sera, Sera. Whatever will be, will be. Our new family motto, it marks a dramatic change from how our son has been raised for the last decade. Jonah was diagnosed with autism when he was almost 4, and ever since then, we've not only been preoccupied with anticipating every behavior he has, but analyzing why he has them. This parenting style has its advantages. Namely, it's prevented me from thinking too far ahead, not even as far as next week. The future is a scary place for every parent, but it's especially so for the parent of a child with autism. No one has ever been able to tell Cynthia or me with any degree of certainty what our son is capable of. Instead, we learn as we go. So does Jonah. Take Hebrew, for instance. It's a crazy language. Sometimes there are vowels, sometimes there aren't. Still, at his bar mitzvah rehearsal the other day, Jonah breezed through his grueling, nerve-wracking, for me anyway, portion of the Torah like he was reciting his ABCs. What I'm capable of is a whole other story. Tradition holds that I make a speech after Jonah is done. I'm supposed to expound on what kind of adult I hope he's going to become. Today, you are a man, that kind of thing. The problem is, I still can't imagine what my son's adulthood is going to look like, even if I get glimpses of it every day. Now, as he waits for the school bus in the morning, he shoos me away. Evidently, I embarrassed him, and it's high time, too. There is also above his lip, visible only to me, the ghost of a future mustache. Once he's off to school, I return to writing my speech, though all I have to show for my efforts thus far is an explanation of zebras, as in what's with the zebras. The answer is that it's the most Jewish of equines. Compared to others in the horse family, it's not the tallest, nor the fastest, nor the strongest. But like my son, it sure makes an impression. I'm also tempted to explain what the last 10 years has required of Jonah and Cynthia and me, how we got to this point. When you have a kid with autism, you soon learn that you have to teach him everything, especially things most kids pick up intuitively, from playing with toys to carrying on a conversation. Then again, I can't leave out how much Jonah keeps teaching me, like how to accept him for who he is, for the growing boy who delights in the moment, the brand new teenager who's remarkably immune to embarrassment, the young man who will always be, let's face it, interesting. Come to think of it, these are not bad qualities to carry into adulthood. Worrying about what others think, about everything that might go wrong, as Jonah also keeps reminding me, is not worth the worry. Wrong is simply the wrong word. In fact, I'd be wise to begin my speech by thanking my son for making me grow up a little. How's this for an opening line? Today, I am a man.
Thank you so much, Joel. Those stories were amazing. I appreciate them so much.
Thank you, Karen.
So tell us, what has quarantine been like for you and Jonah and your wife?
It's probably been a lot like it is for everybody else, with the exception that I'm used to it. I mean, as a writer, that's what this pandemic has sort of played right into my hands. I'm good at self-isolation and keeping my distance. Jonah is much more gregarious than me and likes to go out, and particularly likes to go to restaurants. So it's been a bit of adjustment, but we order food once a week, and he seems to be happy with that. He's been incredibly actually flexible to everything, which is, one of the difficulties with a disorder like autism is inflexibility. But he's been really good, better than me. And my wife is keeping a firm hand on both of us, making us wear masks when we go outside occasionally, and making me scrub down the groceries.
Very good. And what does the future look like now? A few years out from having written this story.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the book I sort of had a much more pessimistic view of the future, and now I guess what I realized even just after the book came out was that the future was coming whether I liked it or not. I still don't know what it looks like. It's not going to be easy, but I have a lot more faith that Jonah will find his way than I probably had when I wrote the book.
That's good to hear. And what are you working on now is the question.
I'm working on a memoir that's taking me a long time, just as this book took me a long time. I'm a slow worker. It's hard to describe. It's a bit of a family history, my family, because I'm the last of the Mohicans in my family, last survivor. So I'm trying to remember my roots, my parents, my sisters, and trying to write about them all and do what writers do, just try to hold on to the past a little longer.
Well, thank you for sharing those. We look forward to reading it when it's ready.
Thank you. I hope it'll be ready soon.
Well,
In time for me to go out on tour at least. Yeah.
we'll look out for it. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Karen. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night.